Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. We're just getting fired up here. Welcome. Hi, Josh. Good to see you out there. Positron. Hi, Austin. Adding you as a speaker. All right. Well,
Hey
why don't
everyone.
we? Good morning, Austin. Or good morning, at least from the West Coast. Why don't we just start getting it moving here? I think Gregory will be joining us. I'm sure Becca. We've got. Um, okay. Becca and Austin, you're going to be leading today. Awesome. Sounds good.
Yeah, I can just take the baton pass. I'm not sure where Rebecca is. Hey
Okay.
Josh.
Yeah, I'm sure she'll
Hey
be here in
Dave.
a sec. But
Hey Alex.
yeah.
I'm not
Feel
sure.
free to fire it up.
Totally. Yeah, I'm happy to fire it up. Uh, Hi Alex. Welcome to Regenerati News Hour. Happy you're here.
Happy to be here.
Um, yeah, I guess I can give a little bit of kind of larger framing about the approach for today and thinking that through. And then when Rebecca comes in, she can chime in. So, I guess from my vantage point, and for those, for the two of you on the call who don't know who I am, or maybe we haven't met before, I'm Austin. I work at the foundation, um, the Regen Foundation, which is a not-for-profit arm of the larger Regen Network. And I have been thinking through some prompts for how to engage in larger discussions around refi and ecological economics. Um, uh, in a way to really sort of highlights and points towards the challenges and like problems of the research endeavor that Regen Network is doing. And definitely the spirit of the larger ecosystem is one that out flourishing the haters is the only way to go. That cooperation through with all of our different sort of um, other different initiatives, DAOs, startups, whatever in the space. The cooperation is the absolute way that this larger project and initiative will grow forward. And yet at the same time, there's a pretty substantial difference in I think what the Regen Network and Foundation are doing. And I think that part of that came up in an acute way when we were talking about what existing standards for eco credits or carbon credits exist and how different refi organizations are sort of building on top of existing standards and sort of benchmarks for carbon sequestration or carbon credits. And I'm talking about Vera and I'm talking about Gold Standard and yeah, the work that they've done is really invaluable in this space. And it opens up an opportunity to talk about within the scope of the Regen Network, like how we're trying to build original methodologies, original scientifically rigorous verifications and attestations of ecological state, and then building agreements around that, and how hairy and wicked and exciting of a research challenge that is, I think is really significant. So that's kind of a long-winded intro to say we've got Alex Corin from Regenerative Community Land Trust here, who is doing a lot of things, talking, writing, building out workflows and sort of models for land trusts, and folding in a way how those might touch credit methodologies, credit methodology development. So like really from the ground up, from the level of private property, from the level of land stewardship, from the historical conventions of land trusts, how are we building like whole new forms of attestation, of proof of regeneration? We talked about that last week. And yeah, not only just making a sort of marketplace for credits, but like the scientific rigor, the social, economic investment that comes into um, building a registry. So we have Alex here because Alex is doing a ton of interesting stuff in the space. Um, Maybe I'm just gonna start out by saying Rebecca, the other co-host, is here. Hi, Rebecca. I don't know if you want to add a few words about the kind of agenda setting or kind of level setting for the conversation today before we ask some questions to Alex.
Thanks, Austin. I think you did a pretty bang up job. I feel like it's really from the ground up is really top on my mind as I think about your work, Alex. And then we also have Claire here from Climate Farmers and their work in creating methodology and credit class, and really this moment of things becoming quite real. So nothing to add, just eager to jump in. So yeah, let's cue Alex.
Totally. Yeah, last time we talked about the kind of cyber physical divide, which is that there is a whole world, the great outdoors, that these digital infrastructures are entangled with and interacting with, and that is a really fun set of questions. So maybe I'll just start with Alex. Maybe you just want to introduce yourself and say hi and just give a little bit of context, and then I'll follow up with some kind of level setting questions that might help the audience understand a little bit better where you're coming from. So you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, sure thing. That sounds great. Thank you, Austin and Rebecca and Regen Network for hosting me here. Glad to be tuning in. So I'm Alex Corin. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Regenerative Community Land Trust. And my background is in environmental science, eco-design, permaculture, community development. It's kind of just been a mild obsession of mine for most of my life here. And Regen CLT in many ways emerged because we were trying to figure out amongst kind of our friend group what it would even look like to buy land as a group of friends that we wanted to regenerate properly, and have that be structured in a really clean way. And lo and behold, stumbled upon the community land trust model. One thing led to another, and a couple of years down the road, here we are. And it really has become apparent to us that the work we're doing at Regen CLT and others that are working kind of in this similar mindset is super critical to the whole refi movement, because it kind of bridges the, like you were saying, the digital physical divide, and grounds things down to the real world. So happy to jump way more into all the details, but Austin, maybe I'll kick back to you for the question.
No, it's perfect. Thanks. Maybe to set us off, like, can you describe what a land trust is in a trad version, and maybe in a version that you're approaching? Like, what are these things? How do they relate to like conventions of like private property ownership? Yeah, just like walk us through what a land trust is to start out.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd say most people probably are familiar with a conservation land trust. And that's simply a private company that's typically a nonprofit that acquires land and just puts it into conservation. And so that obviously plays an important role in today's world, where we're chronically overdeveloping our environment and chopping it all up into pieces. So conservation land trusts are doing great work. A standard land trust, dropping that conservation piece, is just an organization that's a nonprofit that owns and manages land. It's that simple. There could be family trusts that hold property. There could be different trusts for specific areas, or that are maybe addressing a certain problem, trying to protect a watershed. And then this other category of land trust is the community land trust, which is also a private nonprofit corporation. But instead of being restricted to conservation, there's kind of a broader set of community uses that are allowed for that land. So that often includes affordable housing and community spaces, but also could include a mix of conservation and regenerative agriculture, farming, things like that. And so what we're trying to do with the Regenerative Community Land Trust is basically to weave in these other elements that maybe are shortcomings of the community land trust movement, or at least are ways that we see that can take it to the next level. And specifically for us, that looks like taking that community land trust model, which already has a really beautiful, balanced way of governing land and holding it in common nonprofit trust, and weaving that analog governance that has a legacy of success together with ecological design, which is the broad term for permaculture, natural building, regenerative ag. I'd say even good urbanism principles could fall into that category. And then also weaving it together, of course, with the appropriate Web3 technologies. So, that can just make the governance of the land easier. It could create alternative funding avenues that could help support regenerative projects on the ground, because there's nothing inherently regenerative about a community land trust. Many of them today in the US in particular have kind of taken the turn towards affordable housing specifically, which is very important, but it could be, a toxically made house that isn't inherently regenerative. It's doing social good, but we're trying to just weave it all together and just pull all these different elements that seem to be working together under the thesis of, we already have all of these solutions. We just need to really coordinate them together. And the community land trust and the regenerative community land trust approach that we're taking is literally to establish common ground for these other things to emerge.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It's interesting how what I understand as the kind of conventional conservation land trust would be qualified as a conservation easement land trust, and maybe you can kind of correct me if I'm wrong there. But within the sort of larger classification of land trusts, from conservation land trust to community land trust to not just conserving community land trust, but regenerative community land trust, this is where we land with the model that you all are trying to cook up. Is that kind of like a fair trajectory?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the little distinction there would be that a conservation land trust can acquire a conservation easement. So a normal individual or whatever could have a conservation easement. That's just kind of a way of saying, hey, this chunk of property is not allowed to be developed, whether that's to protect it ecologically or more selfishly just to protect the view from your house or something. But a conservation land trust is just a separate entity, and easement's kind of like a separate type of land holding specifically.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting in the sense that I'll maybe just ask this question and then pass it to you over, Rebecca. Like, it's interesting that it's sort of the conservation premise is like, maybe I have a misconception here, is like putting it on ice, like leave it alone, like make it so that it's not developed, is the attitude of conservation, versus the regeneration, which is to say, no, we want to steward its growth, its cultivation. So it's not meant to be made inert through this sort of classification of the land.
And it almost fits better into the like sustainability paradigm, right? Where it's like, okay, like, hey, we can just sustain things and stop chopping up landscapes and just conserve, and that will be enough. And I think especially in this crowd, it's all readily apparent that no, we need to do a little bit more. And whether that's literally regenerating the landscape or creating regenerative communities where people can actually live amongst each other and be connected to these landscapes. And so that's really a big element of the way we see these things too, is that this whole refi movement, all this capital is being allocated to these projects. Landscapes are hopefully going to be restored in a big way. And the reality is that we need people to implement those projects. We need people on the ground to help monitor these things and provide the data for these carbon and eco credit methodologies. And then really I think we all want it to be where we step into this future where the earth is regenerated and these human cultures are also plugged into this more regenerative happening. And the community aspect is so critical, because if we just are going out and doing these regenerative projects and then have to go home to our separated boxes in towns scattered across the world that aren't designed well, there's going to be something missing.
So I feel like when I think about land trusts, I have a really clear picture in my mind because I've spent a lot of time at a land trust near me here in East Tennessee. It's called Narrow Ridge Earth Literacy Center, and friends that have land out there and have, I feel like, experienced in this like outer sphere the challenges of having people living together in agreement, and it really makes me think about the mirror challenge of governance and decision making in Web3, and this this angle of of agreements around, transactions, and then agreements around, crediting and methodologies and verification. There's so many elements to it, and I find that it's the as enormous as that challenge is, I feel like that's where so much of the kind of growth and opportunity lies. It just feels like deeply plural and human and ecological in nature. So I wonder what the experience has been so far, challenges of putting people of different minds in the same space on a landscape to try to regenerate it, Alex.
Yeah, those are all great points. So, I mean, we admittedly are a younger organization. We are working with a group in Puerto Rico to potentially do the first land acquisition and form the first bioregional node that will be the first regenerative community land trust that actually has a land holding here. And even through that process, because we've developed a process to basically go through that complex ideation, let's all get on the same page phase into ultimately what will be leaseholds being administered to farmers and people that will be living on the property. And this first part of the process, we're just calling the initiative proposal, and that seems almost mundane on the surface, but it has proven to be incredibly important because just getting everybody rowing in the same direction is kind of the challenge of our times. And I think there's this very common vision that is emerging of these, sovereign bioregional economies that are very much local and place-based, but connected to this greater global network. And when it comes to any given piece of land, figuring out who are the stakeholders, what are we aiming for here? What are the local politics or zoning laws that might get in the way of what we're trying to do, or what can we work with to use to our benefit, and really figuring out how to do it in the right way too, where we're also respecting fully and integrating with the local community and the indigenous wisdom and peoples that are still there. Because with any sort of land acquisition approach, there's the colonial colonizer thing that really needs to be treaded carefully. And I think that the regenerative community land trust approach, where we're forming these bioregional landholding entities, it really works well for that, because even though we are a more global level, we're working on the global level of coordination and trying to facilitate the emergence of these bioregional community land trusts. It's ultimately comes down to the locals, no matter where they are. So we are in a sense launching these bioregional entities. So the scaled coordination is really important, and working at the right scales, and also making sure that things aren't getting wrapped together that don't necessarily need to be, because the complexity just gets increases the more elements you weave together. And by having a regenerative community land trust that is the title holding stewardship entity for the bioregion, really allows the management of that land and the implementation of regenerative practices and a master plan for that land, keeping that separate in a sense from the activities happening on the land. So if there's a food co-op that emerges, or if there's a large scale regenerative project that emerges that is plugged into eco credits, those are kind of separate activities that are obviously intimately connected to the land and all the other things happening on the land, but they're happening on the land. It keeps the ownership and the management and the collective decision making and governance of the land itself separate from the activities happening on it, which can kind of help compartmentalize decision making and keep people focused on the most important things for whatever they're specifically working on.
Yeah, I mean, this thing brings up just hat tip to like the absolute essential underlying principle. I think that is driving a lot of the regenerative movement is this notion that the bioregion is the kind of the base unit, or the most like sort of durable and actual kind of individuation of culture or ecological boundaries that we can think of, and practicing community practices, knowledge production practices, infrastructure technical practices, et cetera, that are really rooted at the bioregional scale, I feel like is the only way forward. And so I appreciate that you're calling that out and like using that language sort of specifically when you describe your project. I guess I'll follow up with one of the things that you said when you talked about like uh, uh, and we've discussed this in the past, Alex, before, the sort of the relationship of what this process of creating a regenerative community land trust looks like, and how credit methodologies, eco credits, might interact or support a kind of larger viable economic model. Like, how is that sustained on an economic level? So can you say a few words or like what your reflections are, even if they're very early on, which I think is part of the what brings value here, is that it doesn't have to be this a very conventionally understood form of what an eco credit or credit methodology is. But can you describe a little bit about the relationship of eco credits and how that might help play into a sustained financial model for regenerative community land trusts? Like, how does building a methodology help sustain that model, and what would that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way we see it is that really, eco credits, whether it's measuring carbon or water, groundwater recharge into the soil or biodiversity, whatever may emerge, it's inherently place-based and directly connected to a piece of land. And so there are certain tools and techniques and practices in regenerative agriculture and permaculture that can be broadly applied. It's like a bigger design philosophy that then could be implemented into any given piece of property. And so those core design elements and core design principles, broadly ecological design, we want to weave into the regenerative community land trust model, so that it basically says, hey, there's this big window of what can be done. We're not dictating from the top down what the right regenerative practice is here. It depends on that given place and the unique characteristics of the bioregion and the challenges and opportunities they're facing. And then that said, once we kind of look at a piece of land, we acquire it. In the past, it was largely through a paradigm of there's one landowner, whether it's a private person or organization, and they are responsible for everything happening on the land. Maybe they apply for grant funding, but it's very much like up to one person, one organization, one family, that kind of thing. But by bringing land into bioregional trust, that opens up the door for greater collaboration and greater coordination, and really makes it so that basically we can look at a piece of property and we could say, okay, here's this 1,000-acre ranch, and there's this clear opportunity for regenerative practices to happen. And instead of just saying, hey, good luck, landowner, we hope you regenerate this landscape, we can have a place-based community on the ground that's implementing that project. And there could even be like an eco credit or a co-op of sorts, where the people that are actually implementing the work, whether it's planting trees or collecting data or both, are getting are on the receiving end of those eco credits. And the other nice component of this is that when it is just a private individual's property, they might be have the best intentions, but at the end of the day, there's nothing to say that, okay, all this regenerative work, maybe grant funding, whatever, isn't just going to go and they're going to sell it because all of a sudden their property increased in value. So having it in a community land trust basically says that, okay, now we have this perpetual stewardship entity that is never going to sell this land. A core part of this is to take it out of the speculative market forever. And so then you can truly have this regenerative work happening without fear of it just being sold off to a high bidder because the property value increased. And then also, this is maybe more of a larger scale implementation, but in the past, villages and towns emerged around largely extractive and degenerative activities, whether it was mining or some form of industry or a factory. And there's this really unique opportunity that I think is only coming online for the first time now, where we can coordinate people and create these place-based communities that are focused around regenerative work. And so depending on how economically viable the eco credit is for the people doing the work on the ground, you could have an entire village where instead of being built around mining, they're built around regenerating. And that's, I think, really exciting. And especially for when you start looking at just rural development in general and what that rural development can be centered around. If it's centered around these eco credit economies that are fueling place-based communities to implement that work, that is a really exciting future to us.
Sounds like a future I want to be a part of. I mean, that's great. It's like the historical model of economics, which treats ecosystem health as an externality, right? We find these models of mining towns. Well, if it's industrial, not necessarily like mercantile, but that cultures and cities and civilization really emerge around sites of extraction, or there's like a trope that is simplistic but really prevalent, particularly in different parts of the American West. So thinking through this model of hubs and like regenerative sort of networks, like central points with which larger community and practices can emerge around regenerative scale, is like a really interesting flipping of the switch. That's great. We're kind of running out of time, and I want to make space for Claire from Climate Farmers to talk. But maybe Alex, before we close out, is there anything that's like alive for you right now, or you're excited, or that you want folks who are tuning in to know about you all? Like, what's exciting you today?
Oh man, so much. It's just really exciting time. I think there's so much collaboration happening, and we've really been in the mindset of figuring out who we can work with directly. There's this sense of so many groups and individuals converging on this space. And so I think the more that we can collaborate and get to know what each other is all working on and build tools to help each other, the faster we can manifest this beautiful future for us all. So I think just anybody that is interested in what we're up to, reach out to us on Twitter or through our website, become a member. We have some exciting projects coming up soon and would love to have you all participate.
Awesome. I love seeing the world, like historic models of land stewardship, governance, cooperative, all these different things evolving into the new form that they're taking. And I feel like you all are really an exciting prototype and like leading some of that. So thanks, Alex, for hanging out.
Thank you, Austin.
I'm going to pass it. Yeah, totally. I'm going to pass it over to Rebecca, and maybe you can kind of set the stage for the climate farmer conversation. Hi, Claire. Glad you can make it. Take it away, Rebecca.
Totally. And Alex, like, I feel like there's a lot of blending from here on out, thinking about climate farmers, Claire, y'all's work that's taking place on the ground, and thinking of ways that land ownership and community really works together in bringing methodologies to life. So like there's plenty of fun overlap to explore. And I am now just wanting to go visit my land trust friends and hang out with them to think about this more. So thanks for digging into that. It's really exciting, and agreed on collaboration being critical to the moment. Claire, climate farmers, you guys are so busy and doing so much awesome work right now. I don't know how you sleep. All that's happening within the methodology for everybody here who's listening in. These are some rockin' folks. They are working on a methodology and credit class around kind of silvopastoral systems. But I am not the one to speak and share about it. Claire, would you please share with this awesome audience the work that you guys are doing?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. I hope this works. I'm not a big Twitterer, but thanks for the invitation. It's exciting to finally get to speak about some of the work that climate farmers are doing. So we're a European-based startup working sort of for the past year or two to really accelerate the transition for conventional farmers to more regenerative practices, and have been working closely with Regen for for a long time, I think, in various capacities to really get this off the ground. So what our approach is we really want to enable farmers to make this transition and make that as smoothly as possible. So we've got a bit of a two-pronged approach here, where we're getting we've got an academy that is working to basically create networks and educational programs for farmers that are looking for this information, because clearly the first battle is really understanding who you can ask for help and who you can talk to make sure that this transition goes as smoothly as possible. But then clearly the other side of this is to get the farmers financing. And focusing on transition financing. So for farmers that are new to this and are looking for a bit of additional income to smooth out the risks that can occur with sort of implementing something new. So our approach to this is creating our own methodology, which has been an exciting, sometimes fraught, but very definitely interesting process, in which we are creating a methodology that creates a carbon plus credit. So looking clearly and capture the various co-benefits that you see with a change to more regenerative farming practices. So this has been sort of, our team has reviewed, every methodology under the sun, it seems, to get inspiration and really understand what the components of these are. Our aim is to really ensure that the standard of the voluntary carbon credit, or the carbon market, remains high, and really trying to create a credit that buyers can trust, that they know if they're buying this credit, to the best of our ability, we are trying to, one, get as much money towards the farmers, but two, making sure that they've got a product that they know is contributing to something high, to something that's going to last, that's additional, that's scientifically based. So we've been working with various universities over here to develop this. And finally in the final stages of getting this approved to be aligned with the ISO standard 14064, which is the sort of baseline for this sector, and then sending that through to you guys at Regen for a final review and for the peer review round, which we're sort of excited about, so that when this is published on the platform, that we get a bit more feedback to see what makes sense, what makes less sense, or just for pure praise if that's what comes.
Which I love that there's excitement about the peer review process, because you will be one of the first to go through it, and we are equally excited about it. Although I feel like academia, there's not like positive love vibes around what peer review does and is. So we're excited to reform that and make a different relationship to what peer review could be. I think my instinct is always to want to get into like soil carbon modeling and some of the awesome co-benefits like water retention and biodiversity. But I feel like, given the crew that we have in the room and Regeneration Land Trust, I wanted to double down on this idea of like transition, and how transitioning to a regenerative system we often talk about the barriers, and there are plenty of them, many of which are economic and social and cultural. But this idea of what Web3 can do in this space on a lot of different levels, and I think it's very much tied to this idea of a functioning land trust in a way, because the current mechanisms for incentivizing that transition are not substantial enough. It's not enough to make that change. So wondering like what you're seeing in kind of like Web 2 versus Web 3, like what can be offered to push that transition. What are you seeing as the kind of incentives that are working, or ones that you're excited to explore through this kind of methodology and credit class?
Yeah, good question. And I guess for the Regen Ag scene and working with farmers, it's not necessarily the technical solutions that they're excited about. They're, they're really excited about just getting an additional source of income and getting the support that is required to transition. There's a lot of interest so far. I mean, we're still in the early stages of getting this off the ground. So I don't think I can answer your question so well. I think there's this sort of remains to be seen. Clearly, what technology is enabling is this sort of improved monitoring, improved data collection, improved improved trust that we can get through the Regen platform, for example. But I'm not sure if the farmers see that or value that as much as sort of we do. Yeah, I'm not sure if I've given you due credit on that answer there.
No, not at all. I'm curious, and we've got Gregory in the room too, so I want to give him some room. But I think this really touches on the divide that we're trying to conquer, and how the realities on the ground are very much income based, and how can we mobilize interesting and well curated eco credits that surface far more than carbon, which certainly the co-benefits that y'all are exploring in your methodology do that, in a way that boosts that credit price, that enables that to be not just a support, but potentially feeding into this idea of these regenerative land trust communities, that can do this on a kind of community scale. I think there's a lot to be explored. And yeah, Alex, hand up. What you got?
Yeah, hand up. Yeah, just to add to that, I think you hit it on the head. Like at the end of the day, this will all hit the ground once it provides a living for people, or at least could supplement a living, and actually has an opportunity for people to live in these places. Because as through our conversations with different ranchers and people on the ground too, it's become abundantly clear that although all of these refi tools and eco credit methodologies are very much seemingly a piece of the puzzle of this solution we're working towards, at the end of the day, it seems like they just need to function in the background. They just need to be the thing that helps this whole system work, because the people that are actually on the ground implementing these things, some of them may be tech savvy and willing to learn, but a lot of them are too busy or uninterested in the higher orders of technology side of things. So really making this like the magic in the background that just allows these platforms or systems to work well and empowers these people is important, because that gap is too large right now. I think it's too complex for a lot of people. So simplifying and really building these tools for the place-based people on the ground is I think an important way to go about it.
That's awesome. Gregory, want to give some? Oh, we have a question. Yeah, go for it. We have
Yes.
Cyril, go for it.
Yes, what I want to ask about what can we do in order to improve the climate, especially in Africa? Because hence, Africa, we have a lot of climate issues. In this country here, nothing is working at all. We have a lot of climate issues. What can we do in Africa to at least, make our climate, favorable? Yes.
Perhaps I can give it a go, but I don't think there's a simple solution to that. I think what we can do and what we should focus on is really our local environment, and I think that's where we've got power. I mean, if this is trying to change local agriculture to be more regenerative, to think more about how we can improve soil health, how we can improve water retention, and therefore for farmers how that can reduce input costs. I think this is what we can hope for. I mean, Africa is a big place, as everyone knows, and I think we've just got to focus locally.
Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. Appreciate that. Yeah.
Maybe Sophia, if you want to chime in.
Yeah, I have a lot of questions. I'm really excited you hopped on into the Twitter Spaces this morning. because I've been kind of following your guys' work and really interested on the methodology design side. But my question for you is kind of, as we're talking about place-based solutions, I'm curious for your specific ecoregion, in talking to these farmers, what are they most excited to measure? What indicators are they excited? I know we've been talking a little bit about, co-benefits and all the different levels there, but I'm curious kind of your experience on the ground talking with these folks. What are they most excited about?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it does vary. So I know the question of biodiversity is a huge one, and while there's not great scalable solutions there at the moment, I've definitely talked to farmers that are like, I just want to know how many birds, how many insects, and really to understand how that can impact on on the performance of our fields and things. I think generally the farmers that are interested in this have already been doing the soil sampling themselves and trying to track this over time. So we really are working primarily with the sort of the first movers here, so to say. The European situation is slightly different from that in the US, in that the subsidies that farmers do receive is a huge portion of their income, getting close to 50% or higher in some cases. So to some extent, this is sort of a bit of a treat, on top. And it does cover, of course, the transition costs. So what we're seeing with the first movers, back to your question, is that they've already got a lot of data, but they are interested to see how this can be managed remotely. I think for those, we're working with Portuguese and Spanish farmers who are in a quite arid area, so understanding how performance can be improved with water retention, I think is another one that they're quite interested in.
Sophia, did you have you said you had a few questions, so any follow-ups?
No, I can pass off. I know there's a lot of different questions in the room. Yeah, I'm just excited to kind of hear all the different levels of interest, and I know especially kind of from the science side of things, because these indicators and ecosystem health indicators kind of vary from place to place. It's just great to hear different folks and hear you guys integrating with different folks from kind of different regions of the world, and trying to understand. I think the place-based solutions are the direction that a lot of this needs to go. So yeah, thanks for sharing. It's really interesting to hear your perspective on that.
Maybe just one thing to chime in on this, because I think it's like a really salient point, is that we're talking like the point that a non-trivial, almost more than the majority of an income of a particular subset of farmers is through subsidies, and understanding that I think maybe Alex mentioned this, that what can make a model of land trust or regenerative land transition viable is certainly going to be supported by rewards from eco credits and how that can bring resources and bring capacity to different communities. But it's also to say that those are part of a larger network of support and sort of incentives within the space. It's not like this is the solution, but I see it as a kind of pressure of like putting pressure towards incentivizing and legitimizing and making viable regenerative practices. It's not like eco credits are going to resolve like all the sort of economic financial questions, but the more that these things begin to accumulate, they add up and they begin to really help a larger systemic type of transition happen. And that's the mindset that I'm operating under. I don't know. That's what came alive for me from that comment.
Agreed, Austin. Accumulation is a great word to have in mind. It certainly feels like we're at that beginning moment. We've got Gregory in the house. Gregory, thoughts, shares, reflections from you while we've got you.
Good morning, everybody. It's been awesome to just listen in. I'm,
Hey, Gregory, you're muted. I think somebody accidentally hit the mute button.
Oh,
there
sorry
you go.
about that.
Nope, you're back.
Yeah.
Welcome back, everybody.
Did you hear me get going, or was it all lost?
No, it was all lost. Go ahead and fire back up.
Okay. So, yeah, well, good morning, everybody. It's really lovely to just be listening in and, yeah, just kind of taking it all in instead of being the one talking. I'm calling in from California. I'm going to be out here taking a little bit of a break, which should be nice. So, starting a little bit later today, getting some nature time. One of the things that arose for me in listening is just the tension between, on one hand, it being really important to achieve a level of user experience, if we want to use that term, for stakeholders, so that methodologies and verification systems and data collection and even payments and the rails for payments, so that people are being incentivized, land stewards are being incentivized and getting upfront financing and sort of de-risking the activity of regenerating ecosystems and providing carbon credits, that all that stuff needs to be done in a way that it's sort of invisible. And it just sort of feels like, Steve Jobs' auto magic, where it's just happening. But then on the other hand, we're talking about public goods, and we're talking about systems in which we actually do need transparency, and we need accountability, and we need governance. And so that means that sometimes the messy details need to be available to all of the stakeholders when they choose to engage with it. And so there's sort of this creative tension between sort of like hiding the complexity and exposing the complexity and making it open. And I think that's going to be a really big part of what we all have to balance as we're working together, is striving to hide the complexity and maintain simple, clear opportunities, but also making sure that complexity is available for those that want to double click on it and go deeper and engage directly. And I'll wrap up by saying I feel like Wikipedia does a pretty good job of this, right? Because if you dig into a Wikipedia article, you can see all the discussion and conversation and the back and forth and disagreements even that go into there just being sort of a simple encyclopedia article up online. And I think that's kind of the role of Regen Registry in a way, is to make it possible for things to get to the marketplace, to make it possible for people to get paid really easily, but then to have a community that is having open and transparent debates and is using the blockchain to maintain availability and to curate and audit and peer review methodologies, etc. And I think in these conversations, we talk an awful lot about all of those things, specifically on Regenerati News Hour. I think that's because we're trying to build momentum around the concept of an open peer sort of registry system and scientific community. But at the end of the day, I totally agree with everything that folks are saying about this. Really won't get traction and work if land stewards are forced into engaging with that. They really need to be able to be at choice, but be able to engage in a simple way that sort of matches their day-to-day needs. So that's just some thoughts that are arising as I'm listening to this great conversation.
Thanks, Gregory. Expose complexity versus hiding complexity. It's definitely something that we're talking a lot about in kind of registry science world, as we think about what feels less intimidating, but what also feels open source, and it's in other corners of R&D certainly being talked about too. And I know that someone in the audience, Thomas from Branch Out Now, who's working Climate Wiki and Knowledge Commons, I'm sure that you're feeling the same of the beauty of sharing the complexity in the right way that makes it approachable. So I feel like the tension points between user experience and public good, I agree that makes a lot of sense, is resonating with me. That the other tension point that I'm picking up is this one between needing kind of this new view on stewardship and how we're accounting for change over time, and that if we're thinking of the land as the entity that we're tracking instead of just of the individuals, versus kind of this this need to look at a bioregion. So like, what are our different lenses for spaces and for regions? But I
Also,
believe
the data
yeah,
commons, just to
data
chip
commons.
in,
Yeah,
we're also
yeah.
stewarding. I think this is it's like there's nested stewardship or nested care. We're also, in order to accomplish all of that, there's a belief or a theory of change that the sense making data, system, like how do we know that good things are happening in an ecosystem or bad things are happening in an ecosystem? That specific infrastructure really also needs stewardship as a commons. And yeah, so anyway, everything you're saying, love it.
Totally.
And I think you're just going to pass it off too.
Oh, I'm just going to chime in really quickly just to say that the premise, some interesting paper came out recently that around collecting open forest data, and the data collection being oftentimes like very low paid or undervalued work, whereas the value of that data, in its application for models and for the larger sort of mining and data science around the climate has a very high value. So like very much plus oneing the data commons and the ethics around like how communities, bioregions own their own data.
Can I come in here,
break
please?
extractive processes. And pass it off to
I'm a bit
Jimmy.
confused why you keep on saying that there's like the people who collect the data are not particularly compensated very well. When I think one of the reasons why they're not compensated particularly well, even though obviously it's a very hard job, like collecting data physically, is because there's plenty of technology out there to help collect ecological data. For example, drones, satellites, and so forth. I don't really understand the premise that in order to add value to the price of data collected and to essentially democratize the value system that got from where someone wants ecological data to the people who take the ecological data and then use it, that somehow a blockchain startup can come in and basically enhance and make it more efficient, whereby the token is worth something later on. I also think that while I do respect Cosmos a lot, and I, of course, am a Cosmos Atom holder, and of course, I see your background, I think maybe you have some misunderstandings of how the community of people who provide liquidity, which is kind of the purpose of this kind of technology of tokens, will actually see value in providing this liquidity to your project. And I don't mean to be mean to you, but I would really appreciate if I could hear a little bit more about that, because to be honest, it seems like you slapped your academic resume onto this project without the clear tokenomic process in which we token holders return value to ourselves after investing. And I think that's kind of probably the greatest drawback of your presentation.
I'm happy to take that. Well, number one, this isn't a presentation. This is a conversation with some community members
Right.
of Regen Network. I think we can talk about token economics. That's fine, but that's not really what we're talking about here. I think it's fair game to. It is, but it's also important talking about the many different initiatives that are going on.
So, hey, man, if you don't want to answer my question, just say it. I'll just drop down. But I mean, if you feel like this topic that I brought up is not the correct topic in the agenda for today, I get that. But I would just appreciate you to say that so you don't waste anyone else's time.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what I'm saying. I do want to address some pieces because I don't want it to just be sort of like a big oh, they don't ever want to talk about that, because I think it's totally fair game. So so let's briefly talk about it, and then let's if you want to dig into that and have set up a whole space to dig into token economics and pros and cons, mistakes, next steps, totally down to do that. That sounds awesome. I think
this kind of conversation has been had for decades, for example, regarding carbon exchanges. And I feel that one of the problems with carbon exchanges, like the one in Chicago back in the day, was that it wasn't very clear the value proposition to those who used it. And partially that was because essentially the reward system of people who were either investors of the carbon exchange itself or those who traded carbon credits um, saw like some short-term value, but the long-term value was not there. And I think if you read the guy who made the carbon exchange, or at least not like made it, but inspired the idea, he wrote a book about it too, and he explains a lot of the problems related to what people understood the purpose versus what he and the original team thought the purpose was supposed to be, and it was kind of lost in translation. And I feel like a lot of your conversation here today has regarding token holders has been lost in translation, in my personal opinion.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we haven't really been talking about speculative token holders at all in this conversation. I think we've been talking about land stewards. So there's an assumption, and that assumption may or may not be true. I happen to think it's true, that there's a demand for carbon credits for a variety of different reasons. One of the things that's very different from when the initial Chicago Climate Exchange launched is that it is now broadly considered to be fiduciary responsibility for corporates to balance their carbon budgets. So before that, they launched that carbon exchange when there was really zero demand for carbon except for like an initial bump because everybody knew it needed to happen. But there was really no sort of like larger societal acceptance to the value of a carbon credit. And I think still we're seeing that the carbon markets are immature and evolving quickly, but it's radically different. Like you can't be a corporate leader now and not have a net zero plan.
So I would say
that's
if you're the corporate leader of Huawei, of Tencent, of the largest companies in India, I mean, so even though most of the equity markets are based in the US, most of the international corporate equity value is not in the US, right? And I don't think if you go to Thailand, because this topic has been brought up before, like Singapore was trying to create its own exchange, right? And they basically wanted to be a regional exchange because obviously most of the burning that happens is obviously not in Singapore, it's in Indonesia, Thailand, and Laos. And their value proposition was that farmers would stop burning because they would basically be paid for those trees to suck the emissions, and they would be compensated for that. But companies which would be polluters would basically be the ones compensating it through the exchange process of what Singapore was trying to create. But obviously, it never came to fruition. And I would argue that the reason why is because most people think that if there are people who are part of corporate governance outside the U.S., do not think it's their fiduciary responsibility outside of the United States and Europe.
For Europe and the United States,
yeah,
which are the two biggest. And China.
So China is the largest economy, or maybe like on the same level, but also India's
So the three largest subsections of the global economy, China, the Eurozone, and the United States, all consider it part of fiduciary responsibility to.
I would argue I don't know a single Chinese company that really cares that much about it. If they did, you would definitely see them trade more carbon credits. I think maybe referring to ones like based in Hong Kong or.
You do realize they just started a national cap and trade system in China, right? So they have said, yeah. So there's a regulated, I mean, we can say it's not good. We can, I mean, all of these things are nascent, but I think to sort of just dismiss it out of hand because 20 years ago, the Chicago Carbon Exchange failed for.
I'm not dismissing that. I'm dismissing the project out of hand.
The point. Yeah, you are. You're being very dismissive.
Because the truth is, I mean, most token holders, I don't think particularly see. We're not even like institutions or companies. We're just regular people who don't see the value. But okay, I'll just be quiet now. I see that I don't want to suck up more of the conversation, so I'll just drop it. Thanks.
Yeah. So I'll do a quick wrap up, and then we should just keep diving in. So I think from my perspective, Regen Network a little while ago, the R&D Inc., I should say, and variety of different community members, I think, saw the voluntary carbon markets and some big shifts that have happened in voluntary carbon markets. And I'm sure that climate farmers can speak to this as a really interesting opportunity to start engaging with leveraging public blockchain technology to meet kind of a market gap. But, again, I think my perspective, at least, having kind of been in the trenches here for quite a while working on all of this, is that really what we're trying to do is sort of significantly bigger than addressing the voluntary carbon market. What we're trying to do is create a public infrastructure for people to value ecological health, right? And voluntary carbon credits are one important way that that's happening. And there's really large growing markets around that, despite what our recent guests might think. And that's sort of the thing that's backing that is pretty hard economics. I think the voluntary carbon markets went up more than 30% a year over the last 4 years. So there's really quite an interesting uptrend. Now, I would be the first person to critique a lot of the way that the carbon market mechanisms are working, but there's demand, there's interest, and there's people sort of engaging. And I think bringing it back to what we're talking about here, what are the mechanics to create the right infrastructure so that sort of accounting for public goods happens in a way that's really empowering the users, the network stakeholders, and creating real, that the tokens themselves, eco-credit tokens now that I'm talking about, are really backed by true ecological health. And I think sort of recentering on that and the topics or the guests that we've got is a great next move here.
Seems like there's more interest for conversation. I have to hop, but maybe people can stay on. I know that Josh just wanted to say something, and Alex too. I mean, just to hold that, I'm thankful that this news hour holds space for a pluralism and a diversity of conversations within regenerative practices, and makes the connections and asks the hard questions about how they tether together. So just I'm going to have to hop off, but thanks so much for Climate Farmers and Regenerative Community Land Trust to sort of take a big picture and sort of level set and establish where a lot of these other more focused conversations are emerging from. So thanks all. I'm going to pass the mic.
A big thanks to Gregory. Thanks for centering. I feel like to you, Alex and Claire, thanks for sharing your work, which is on the ground some of the hardest work there is. And I personally really appreciate the questions that you're asking, and the way that you are moving things forward. So I feel like I look forward to seeing what the next weeks and months bring, because it's going to be a lot given all that you both are achieving with your work. So keep it up. Know you have R&D behind you, and thanks for everybody for holding space here. I also have to jump. Thanks to Austin. Thanks to Dave. Cheers to more news hours wherever they might land.
Thanks everybody for joining us. We're gonna wrap up same time, same place next week. So thank you. Have a great rest of your week. Get outside, enjoy the beautiful outdoors. Take care, everybody.